So now we are live. Hello, everybody. Hi, Mark. Hi, Katherine.
Hello.
How are you doing, Mark?
I'm very well, thank you. It's fine weather here in Geneva. Looking forward to our conversation.
Same for us. Thanks a lot for being here, Mark Knight. So you published a paper a couple of months, a little bit less than a year ago, entitled "Ending Armed Conflicts Beyond Mediation." And so Katherine and myself, we thought this is quite an interesting topic, and we were interested in knowing a bit more. We read obviously your paper, and then thought, okay, we have to invite Mark to have a discussion on the Piece of the Puzzle podcast. That's where we are today, and we are really happy to have you with us and to know more about this concept. Maybe before we start getting into the concept and where it emerges from and so on, maybe if you can say a few words about yourself, Mark. Who are you? Where do you work? You know.
Okay, so quick overview of my background. Um, a very, very long time ago, I'm from the UK, so I was in the British Army. After I left, I headed off into the humanitarian field and expected to work in refugee camps and ended up in demobilization camps by accident. And that was the first job in the international field in the post-conflict Sierra Leone in 1998. And since then, I've moved forward within the theme of security and human rights, as I could identify it now, in three basic areas: the technical implementation of post-conflict programs, which were often focused on security and the demobilization, support to mediation, which has included preparing non-state armed groups for initially ceasefires and also dialogue, and as a general consultant, the work on field work on research and report composition for sometimes policies, sometimes for knowledge. So they're the three areas. And as I just mentioned, I started in Sierra Leone in '98. I've worked in a number of African countries, also Asia, in Indonesia and Nepal and Indonesia, for long periods, and then shorter periods in Afghanistan and Iraq. Most in Iraq, actually, I was doing something outside the humanitarian field where I was undertaking human rights risk and impact assessments for private security companies. It being here in Geneva, I got involved in an oversight mechanism for private security, the International Code of Conduct, which introduced me in more detail to the human rights aspect of the security work. So that gets me to, a consultant now based in Geneva, still working predominantly on conflict, pre-conflict, as in, talking to armed actors that are preparing for or engaged in dialogue. And I title that under, security and human rights, basically.
Thank you, Mark. Really broad experience. And I think that already explains a little bit the origin of the paper. Though I think it also reflects a lot of your experience. But more than that, why does this paper come now? What's the whatever institutional, political context? Where does it emerge from?
Okay, there's there's two nexus, if you like, that led to this. One is the accumulation of experience. I mean, the first time I was asked to speak to a non-state armed group was on ceasefires. And that delivery was all technical about historically, this is what happened there, this is what happened there. And at the end of it, I was very aware this hasn't delivered to them. They don't know anything that they probably didn't know before. And as I was asked to do it again and again and again, I developed an understanding that the non-state armed groups had to go through a longer process of transition from purely military to, as a minimum, sometimes they pass through the phase of military and political, but then through the peace agreement, where the traditional mediation happens, to a purely political entity or political capacity to achieve their objectives. And as I engage with them more, I just by engaging with them started a process of formulating an approach that they engaged with, they worked with. And I'll give you a quick example. On the ceasefire stuff, it was very simple. You asked them to say what the purpose of the ceasefire was that they were going to have. They're engaging with third parties, internationals, possibly for the first time. And we were advising them, you want a ceasefire, this is how you do it. But you have to decide what you want from this ceasefire. And it has to be a political objective, which could be the first time they had to delineate between military and political objectives, which meant they had to we started a process with them where they had to think forward to what does their win look like? And they have to articulate it in political terms. And during this process, we always give them the tools of human rights to articulate things, which we come back to later. So when they articulate in human rights terms, the third party, as in the international community, immediately understand and can engage with what they're saying, as opposed to any other way. That was one thing. That was the process of learning. I was always aware that there was a gap from my experience on what I had told armed groups, or during peace processes, or during implementation of peace processes. I was never really sure what we're supposed to tell them. We're doing this for peace. And the question was, what is peace? And when you can't answer that immediately, you're there telling them what to do, you've got a problem. So I was always trying to answer these questions. And I have a number of previous publications on online journals where I was just dealing with little problems that I met on my last job, basically. So how to do DDR better, how to do SSR, what we don't think about when we're, doing DDR, that sort of things. It was a learning process. But in January 2024? Yeah, January 2024, I started to write these down in little bite-sized articles that I put on my LinkedIn. And you can see the 7 of them there that go through the thought process of what's the framework when we engage. It's a human rights framework. What does that mean? And they're, it's like 20 pages when you put them all together. And that was the thought process. And then in February 2024, the Accord series came out, which I'm sure you're aware of, the number 30, series 30, the Accord series, which is, still time to talk, adaptation and innovation in peace mediation. So basically that was a snapshot of all global activity on mediation. And it was also states at the beginning, innovation is needed. The conflicts have changed. Mediation doesn't meet the needs anymore. We need to innovate to move forward. And then gave, a summary of what it was. It's a very good publication. So that with that framework, I could put my thought process into something and say, this is, as the article says, this is mediation. This is where it falls short. This is the wider view, which is the war to peace transition. And what we're missing is advice to the armed actors. Within all the peace building arena, we do, community-based CSO, NGO peace building activities. We do state building. We do, all these other things. We do mediation. But I found from experience that once armed groups had got through the agreement, they weren't ready for politics, or they agreed to do a security transition that was basically the same as defeat, because they just handed they hand away their military capacity without actually getting any political capacity. And also my opinion that many of these internal armed conflicts, if not initiated, as a minimum, are often driven by the actions of the state security providers. So, but our approach to solving armed conflict, didn't really grasp the two key things, the armed actors on either side. So I wanted to produce something that answered the question, what am I advising you, and how do we get there, and what is it we're trying to do? It's not mediation. We're ending an armed conflict. That's what we want to do. And I thought we have to do that by giving specific advice to both parties that are fighting with a common objective, which was, in simple terms in the article, my understanding of what peace is, which is an environment where human rights are protected by the rule of law, which is clearly a evolving thing, right? So that's how we got there, basically.
This is so insightful, Mark. I must say at this point, really also warm welcome from my side. And hi, everybody. I enjoyed reading this paper. It's not the first time that I've read it. I read it shortly after it came out. And I thought it was really, it's well researched and written, and it's a little bit provocative as well. I mean, at least in the title.
Yeah.
And I think what really resonated with me is that you make the link to security and sort of the security arrangement, the discussion, sort of security sector reform, right? That sort of we both have a background in, which is often overlooked if you look at peace processes. And the other really important aspect you mentioned is discussing a human rights framework early on. So with this in mind, I think we were also reflecting a little bit, because mediation, when you have mediation activities, in particular on an international level, mediators bring in additional advice. You have constitutional committees, you have a committee that looks at gender issues, etc. Is this what you suggest, sort of advising armed actors? Is this an entirely new approach? Does it exist already? In how much does it differ from what sort of the regular peace process support already does? And maybe also what I find very interesting, a second question tied to that is, who is well placed to be advising from your experience?
Okay, these are great. So to the first one, there's the core difference, and this is, you say it's being provocative. It is being provocative in this core difference, which I don't articulate, but it's clearly there in the advice. To both parties to the armed conflict, in effect, the advice is, this is how you win. This is how you win when we consider a win an environment where human rights are protected by the rule of law, because that's what we're aiming for as the third party. And all our advice will move you down the road to that endpoint. And that is a win for you. And it's the same win for both parties. But you work it all the way back and you see the advice as it's framed there. It is even controversial. I'd say the most controversial thing is the advice to states. And that kind of comes to your second question, which I'll quickly jump onto, then go back and answer the technical advice during negotiations question. I think, and I think I make the point slightly there, that the only entity that can advise a state which is executing an armed conflict, which it considers legitimate, is another state. It's the only one they'll listen to, right? Not an NGO, not someone talking about peace, a state that's saying, look, this is how you've got to do it. So I articulate in that the advice that should be given. So if a state is advising a state, it's like, firstly, we need a human rights framework. Secondly, you understand we're trying to get to this point of human rights protected by the rule of law, which is an environment which is constantly evolving. And the way you do that, as it says in there, the controversial thing is you're fighting, what you want to achieve is legitimacy. And that is given to you by the people. So it's a struggle for legitimacy amongst the people. And to get that across to a state whose security actors could be driving the conflict through their actions, you see that's a long process to react to that and integrate it and change how they operate. But they could do it, but only a state can do that. On the other side, the non-state armed groups, I think there are plenty of organizations presently that have the capacity to establish communications with non-state armed groups and sustain that communications. On that aspect, I'm adding, what the concept of what you should be telling them over a very long period of time. And the difference is not, we're here to get peace. We're here to get peace that we understand this. So we're going to advise you how to get there. And that is in a way that you achieve what you want to achieve. But we're going to do it in political terms at the end because we're going through a peace process to get there. So there's lots of entities that can do that. I think that this doctrine, if you like, or this approach to advice is probably new to that. Your first question quickly, and I'll try and summarize this. Presently, and in the article, you'll see I do a little diagram where I have conflict, peace process with mediation and then the post-conflict in a diagram, and the advice on both sides, starting during the conflict and going all the way through implementation after the agreement. So mediation can exist as it does. And during those processes of dialogue, mediation to a peace agreement, if they exist at all now, which part of the problem is that the conflicts are too fragmented for that. If that exists, then the technical expertise can come in to provide support and advice to the parties. But the advice and support they're giving is the international framework. This is what DDR is, and this is how you should do it, and this is why you should do it. And that's what benefits us, the third party. Whereas the advice to armed actors is, this is what it'll look like, and this is how you need to manage that in a way where you get what you want, which is a balanced exchange of military for political capacity. So that's the core difference. I would understand it as, based on my experience of what I tried to articulate there.
Which I think is exactly the point that is provocative in a way and challenging and delicate, because you mentioned the word legitimacy. And I think often this is exactly the point. Can you negotiate with armed groups or with these specific parties to a conflict? What's their legitimacy, right?
In the first one I wrote on LinkedIn, I sort of like tried to deal with that in that I was like, okay, what is a viable armed group that we can engage with? And it was a bit prescriptive. And I think by the end, when I get to the end of this thought process with the article, I'm describing this should work for pre-political, sub-political, so gangs or criminal groups that are engaged in more violence than politically motivated entities, and prescribed groups, which is they're prescribed as terrorists. And because, when you think I started in 98 and saw, went through the last 20 years of international armed conflict, in 2001, there were groups that no one thought they could ever speak to, but it evolves, it evolves to the point where the conflicts evolves, people involved in the conflicts, the belligerents evolve to the point where, they want to articulate a win in a different way, and you can see that the two things that are different, I find, with non-state armed groups, there is a motive why they fight, i.e. there was injustice coming at them, and it's usually from the state, often it's from the state and the state security providers. And then next, there's a vehicle that moves that forward. And one of the interesting places, if you look at Mindanao, how the vehicle has changed over time in the names of the armed groups, from nationalist to, Islamic to Islamist. It's evolved. That's just the vehicle changing that drives the same conflict forward. So that does change. And the approach here is that if you have the capacity to engage early and maintain that capacity over a decade, then that's where you get your impact. So that's the difficult part to some extent.
Mm. Yeah, so you're mentioning this process, which is a long-term process, where sometimes actors change the vehicle and complex in all terms. There are many actors, there are different phases of the conflict. We transition from armed conflict to, in best case, to human rights protected by rule of law, according to your approach. So how actually I'm wondering how to coordinate all that, because you have mediation. In best case, you have multi-track mediation. Then you have other actors. You have now this new your approach, this advising armed actors, advisors. Um, who is coordinating whom in that whole setting?
Let me quickly mention, as you mentioned again, when I say one of the questions I was trying to ask her is, what is peace? And I answered it with, an environment where human rights are protected by the rule of law. I came to that through engaging with non-state armed groups, preparing them for ceasefires, when I would use a paragraph from the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says, so I paraphrase, I apologize, but therefore, if man is not to have compulsion as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, human rights should be protected by the rule of law. So when I engage with these groups, I would say, are you by chance compelled as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression? Now, few of them would say, no, that's not us. We do it because we like it, or, we do it for the money. They're like, yes, you've articulated it perfectly. And then I can say, well, funnily enough, I've got the answer for you. And it's an environment where human rights are protected by the rule of law. If we got to that, would you need this rebellion? And it's kind of cartoony and kitschy, but it's an articulation of, it is, you are not doing, it's understood what you're doing, and there's an end point, and this is how it's articulated. So that's good human rights terminology. Let's start using that when you talk to people about what you're doing. So that's the start of the human rights framework. In terms of your question on coordination, again, I don't want to be flippant, but I'm going to answer that the donor, whoever pays for it, is the actual key question here. The coordination is, if this approach was operationalized in the openness of articulating what we're saying, it's very clear. We'd be very clear if you had the capacity to deliver this, i.e., to establish and maintain relations with both sides, which means going through a state on the other, right? And maintaining that over a long period of time and being able to move with them down that track and help them down that track to, what we're trying to get them to. It's not so much who you're engaging with. You'll engage, externally with anyone. In the paper, I suggest that actually in the context, it's going to be different each time what a conglomerate of groups that can engage with those actors is. But you need something set back which holds the data and the support for them to do it. So you can train them and bring them out and train them and send them back and support that for them. But there's no professional cadre doing it at the forefront. There's a professional cadre holding the learnt information and moving, having the support to share that between different contexts. So in a way, before I got to coordination, I'd get to how do you establish that and support it? And I don't have that answer, and I haven't really tried to answer it, to tell you the truth. But the coordination would simply come through being completely open with all third parties and say, look, this is what we tell them. We tell them this. We can't tell them where we do it, how we do it, or anything, but you know exactly what we're telling them and what we're trying to get to. So, that's it really. No secrecy on the thematic approach, basically.
I think one thing I really liked in the paper remark is that it is provides a lot of examples. And so if you look back from your experience, and maybe if you want to add on sort of looking maybe at conflicts that have not been necessarily integrated in the paper at the time, quite dramatically so, since then. So what are maybe some of the lessons learned that are really useful to retain for you, also personally from your experience, some of the countries, some of the conflicts that you examined, and what are some of the key challenges that you also feel remain, and how could we address them?
Brilliant. I think I've got three. I can remember two in my head at once, and I might forget the third one. So the first one is that violence is an emotional activity. And predominantly, our approach is very logical to them and to the actors. And we need to develop something which accepts that this is an existential cry for existence as well. That seems very sort of, esoteric, but violence is emotional, and the people that rise in that environment, do have natural capacities that can be transitioned. But the international approach is predominantly, the concept of mediation is logic. We're bringing a superior logic that you haven't thought of to end this. And it's like only through the engagement over a long period of time where trust is built, do you engage with them on the level that they're operating, I think. It's one of the lessons I've learned that, you have to understand them on a very personal level as well, why they fight. And they can tell you their story, and it's usually horrific. And then the vehicle and what they fight for, is different. But why they fight is what you have to engage them on. It's emotional. And we can't just be logical. I said I'd remember two, but I didn't. I remembered one. What was the theme again you were going at?
I was looking in more concrete, and concrete examples, maybe, from the examples that you also cite in the paper on where some of the advising really bear fruit, where you could see a process. And I mean, you mentioned Northern Ireland, and I think that's really it's still, I think people are debating this, but I think in hindsight and looking at other conflict resolution processes, it's still one of the processes that went quite well, considering all the challenges I think that were there at the time.
The second quick thing I'll do, then I'll come on to that examples. The second lesson, I think, sometimes they win. They get what they want, and then they're in deep trouble. And I'm thinking about, for example, Aceh, when I was demobilizing a group that I'd spoken to and engaged with in a previous peace process. So I knew the GAM quite well. And then the peace process meant that they had elections and they won the elections. And that was a complete defeat for them, right? Retrospectively, because a lot of them knew me and came and said, what on earth do we do here? We've got one position at the top of a structure whose whole raison d'etre was to defeat us, and now we're supposed to control it. How does that work? And you're like, I don't have anything for you. I'm sorry. We should have predicted this, but we didn't. So I'm sorry. So that's part of the preparing them incrementally for political continuation of political activities, which takes us to Northern Ireland. And the examples that I give, for example, in Northern Ireland, the Provisional IRA had a very clear political structure. And they had, within that structure, within that ideology, they had a clear understanding of when the armed sort of like rebellion was necessary, and you could start and stop it. So they could continue their objectives through political. They always had two streams. But within their ideology, they could stop the military and carry on, which is what they could do. So it didn't make it an easy process, but that was instrumental. If you look at the Maoists, the Maoists have a clear understanding of that as well. And my example of GAM, they didn't. They were still emotive, reactive, defensive of their community and their sense of identity. And then now you're in head of a bureaucratic, civil service. It's not going to work, so it didn't work. The example, I learned about the example, I wasn't directly involved in the process. I learned about the example of the Basque Country and ETA on a study tour where, ironically, I sat for 3 days next to an ex-Provisional IRA gunman. And as I said, I was in the army, so I served in Northern Ireland on the other side. So it was interesting to speak to him and get that perspective. And as you say, the world moves on to such an extent that our common cultures were now more in common because of the evolution, in global politics than it ever was, back in the conflict. We're like we're from the same place, if you see what I mean. So our identities were a lot closer then than they were. I was surprised at that. I was also very surprised at their absolute commitment to their cause. I mean, it was unwavering, and that was impressive. But in the ETA example, this is where I got the idea that the state has to engage. You have to get the state to engage, because with ETA, they didn't. They refused to engage with them. So ETA did something really brilliant in that, firstly, they went through their own process to decide, is the armed struggle over within all their structures? And they decided it was, which is key, because once you get to this dialogue point, for non-state armed groups, they're in great danger of fragmentation. And that's the last thing you want. One of the approaches, one of the deliverables of this approach is we keep the armed group together instead of fragmenting them, because then we can't do anything. We've got instability for a decade. So keep them together, move them forward, which one of the lessons from Mozambique was the parties decide on the time frame. They go forward, they stop, they go back, they go forward. You have to be able to go with the party's time, not yours. So ETA quickly, they decided to disarm, but they disarmed two civil society organizations. But in their mind, they disarmed, they gave their weapons back to the people who had authorized the weapons. So they disarmed to the people who happened to be the electorate. There was so many layers of cleverness. And then obviously they win the election because they're reacting directly to them. But they lose an election after that as a purely political entity over rubbish collection, over refuse collection. Now, you're a political entity when you've fought a 30-year war and you lose over when you pick up the rubbish from people's houses, right? But that's a sort of like telling lesson that I learned from the ETA example. There you go. There's my examples that are mentioned in the paper as the war to peace transition.
Thanks, Mark. Maybe before I ask my next question, those watching us in live, you can ask questions. So we are open for questions. On the YouTube, you have the chat. Normally, it's on the right side. You can just ask your questions, and then we'll forward it to Mark. Talking about what you just mentioned, Mark, the goals, the ideologies, and so on. There was one part in the paper that really puzzled me. I think it got a bit clearer to me now with the discussion, but I still want to ask you to be sure. So you're arguing that in order to advise those actors, armed groups, you have to definitely not undermine their goals or ethics, and ideally support them. So now I wonder, how do you do that for a state who is not respecting international law or violating human rights? How do you do that for an armed group such as a terrorist group, for instance? How can you support their goals and ethics?
Okay, I'd say this. At the beginning of any armed conflict, the reaction to an uprising, if that's what it is, or an armed insurrection, is as emotional from the state as the uprising itself or the insurrection itself. And the anger and the sense of betrayal is like, this is beyond the pale. There's no reason for this. Obviously, they feel there is. And, in any conflict, when you go back and look at it in the calm light of peace, you're like, there was clearly a reason for this uprising, right? Even in your own context. So how do you deal with the fact? The initial thing on all of them, I say, is establish a human rights framework, which is firstly, introduce the human rights terminology, how they articulate themselves. Secondly, articulate your endpoint. Why am I here to talk to you? It's to get to an environment where human rights are protected by the rule of law. That's where I'm getting to. And I will judge myself as the third party on the impacts on human rights. That's how I'll do it. That's the measure stick that I'll use for what I do here. If it gets bad, then obviously I'm having a bad impact and I need to change or withdraw or do something. But to the actual group, you can engage with them and say, listen, this is our objective. This is our endpoint. if you articulate to us that your objective is incompatible with this human rights framework or endpoint, then we're going to sit here and talk to you until you can articulate or you can evolve into another endpoint. But it's not like it's over, you know. You want to kill everyone that wears, you know, pink tops. You know, for example, you know,
You're actually
we'll
mediating the
continue to
goal with them.
talk to you
Yeah.
until you evolve beyond that, and then we can start moving forward. But we won't withdraw simply because, you know, your anger is revengeful and you want to do this. We're gonna advise you that you won't get there. We're gonna advise you that we're advising the state and you'll lose on this ground. So, but you just keep going. But it's the human right. When they articulate something which is compatible, then you can start moving forward. Basically, again, you can see the problem with that is operationalizing it. How do you have a platform that can manage and establish and maintain that when they are clearly, you know, for 2 years that you're engaging with them, engaging in gross human rights abuse? That's hard. I don't know, but conceptually I can answer it.
I think it also raises the question of amnesty, right? And that's of course, because how do you separate that from your advising role? Because it's hard to combine both, but of course, there's also certain acts that you have to stand trial for. So I think this is the whole dilemma. Do you have any quick thoughts on how to handle that?
I think there's different approaches. I would be worried about what I said at the beginning, that the difference between technical expert advice during dialogue is this is our framework. This is the third party international framework, and we're going to tell you how to do it, as opposed to the advice that says this is what the third party international framework will look like. This is what is useful to you, but you have to manage this in this way to get through it and what you want. So there's a slight difference, but we get into that arena. Restorative, I haven't got the justice. And I would come back to the example where I sat for 3 days with an ex-provisional IRA gunman. As you know, it can be overcome. You know, time is a great healer is one thing. I'd say that the core aspect is that if I was advising them, I would say no one has the authority to pardon international crimes. That authority doesn't exist. And there may well be a process in the future where you have to answer for those. But I'd also look at the recent Mozambique example where it was a genuinely party-led process in terms of timing, focus, the structures of what they put together to solve problems were the parties sat together with usually one person from the third party that would provide support or advice as it was sought. And they managed to solve that problem themselves. You know, what do we do about this? How do we move forward? And I won't say what it was, but, you know, the answer to that is a genuine agreement on how to deal with it between the parties, not only the belligerent parties, but the wider society, right? They have to deal with it, not as imposing it, but justice is usually required because, as I said, the two reactions at the beginning of conflict are emotional. And the third part is the victim's emotions are still factors that will not allow for stability and have to be dealt with by the context with support from the third party, I'd say. That's kind of like, it sounds a bit mealy-mouthed to get out of it, but that's how I'd approach it.
Great, thanks. Pascal, are we trying to slowly come to a conclusion and an outlook?
Yeah, I would have a question on the future role of mediation in all that. So how do you envision mediation, especially in relation to this advisory approach? How can mediation evolve? Because in your paper, you explain how to put it. Mediation becomes I think we can say less successful in the recent years, according to a couple of statistics that you mentioned. So being a mediation podcast, a peace mediation
Yeah.
podcast, we are obviously worried about this. What is your point? What do you see? How can mediation evolve, and maybe especially in relation to your approach?
Well, one of the motives for sort of like coming to this paper was, having been involved in different aspects of armed conflict or conflict programming, the amount of people that I was meeting that identified as mediators, they got their business card, I'm a mediator, and it was the Accord series that clarified it for me. I was like, okay, that is a snapshot of the mediation field as it stands. And the first thing it says in the first paragraph is, let's have a look. Mediation is under severe pressure. The value of mediation as a tool to facilitate political solutions to violent conflict is therefore under severe pressure. I agree, it is. This, in a way, is a way of taking some of that pressure off, because in the article I put a little diagram where mediation still exists as a central thing, a central point through which the parties pass, where they articulate, in agreement, how I will transition my military to political, or what my agreement is to dissolve my military capacity or integrate it into the state in order to get political capacity and power to continue to seek my objectives. So that still exists. And in a way, again, the article, the Accord, and I quote it, says that, mediation is, it's professionalized, it's expanded, it's diversified, and it's stopped producing any goods, So there was a problem. It's a massive structure for it. There's processes, there's support, there's entities that do it, but it's not producing the goods as it used to because conflict changed. So this approach works around and with mediation and helps it focus on the core thing that it does at that central juncture where they agree how they're going to do this transition, which the advice has been given them for 2 years prior to that, which gets them to that point where they know what they're talking about. They know that they can still seek their objectives in a post-agreement world. And then the support continues after the agreement, because the implementation of peace agreements, one of my key lessons, by the way, I should have mentioned at the beginning, is simply a continuation of the political dialogue between the parties. They've agreed on the day that this is what they'll do. The next day, new factors are in play and they have to renegotiate. So the agreement is set for a day, if you like, but the implementation is just a continuation of that political negotiation on how they're going to do it. And they still need the support to do that.
I think what you mentioned really shows quite well how different processes have to tie into each other, right? Because basically when you start advising, you discuss security arrangements as well. So how does a stable society have to look like? What do you need so that you disarm?
Yeah.
How does police look like? How does the military structure look like, etc., which then is so important for the implementation phase as well, and which we see often is not properly discussed, it feels, and then the implementation is just a nightmare.
Well, there is post-conflict implementation is a political activity, not a technical activity. And as third parties, if we treat it as a technical, it fails because it's political and there's no one operating at that level anymore. Again, Mozambique and the Renamo process is a key example of how that works. When the political third party continue and do the actual operational delivery because it's political and it's a continuation. So that was a key lesson as well. So you're absolutely right. I agree.
Okay.
Great.
That's
So
why do you have a final question? Or do we have a final question from one of the live participants?
One of the two people in the audience.
no, there are a couple
Let
today.
not fool you. We have actually a lot of views afterwards. So
Yeah, I know. That's going to be fun to watch that.
Yeah. No, we have a good audience today, but no questions. That I don't have an additional question, but statement. So I see there's still hope for mediation. Then Thanks a lot, Mark, for this very instructive discussion. I learned a lot.
Well, last thing to say, anyone that is sort of like looking at it, if you go to the GCSP website, you can find the article there. It'll be there for, until the end of time, I imagine.
Actually, we could post it in the comments.
Oh,
Yeah.
cool. Yeah.
Yeah, we do that for sure. Mark, I want to have a separate session with you on the limitations of this approach, because I'm thinking of Haiti in particular, as this is in my region, and what you do when a state is basically collapsing because of armed groups, and you wonder what the political
Yeah.
will behind this. But that is a thing that needs an entirely separate conversation, but I'd be really happy to talk to you about it.
And it would be an interesting, because this is still built on the idea that there is a state. But if you've got just 2 or 3 non-state armed groups that won within a traditional state boundary, what do you do then? You're not negotiating with a state, and you've got 3 different armed groups to try and bring together and get. That's a completely new arena for us, right?
Actually, I think you have to write another paper.
Oh my goodness, they're difficult, but
Great. It was really so great to have you, Mark. Thank you so much for making the time.
No, well, thank you very much for our conversation. I do enjoy it. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Have a good